15. Onslaught. Berani was slouched near the entrance to his bunkhouse, slowly nursing a warm cup of water which had sat out through the night. It was the very early morning of the 30th of Niheliol, though here, in the tunnel system beneath the earthworks backing the wall, no hint of the moon or sun could reach them. Even if they had been up at their watchposts on the last wall, it was far too early for sunrise to be anything more than a hinted brightening of the distant horizon. The air was slightly clouded, for the tunnels west along the line beneath Esh had been breached days back, and the moisture from the rain-soaked exterior kept the air thick. Though power had been fast restored to neighboring forts and wall spans, and fans developed for mining were now being used to vent the dust and refuse of the ongoing bombardment back out into the open air, the droning machines couldn't get rid of all of it. Berani's throat was constantly dry down here in the press of the tunnels with the haze of bombardment-churned stone all about him, and his tongue was ever taunted with the faint, almost salty taste of rock or gravel, as if he were walking around with a pebble clenched in his jaw. His water, which he'd forgotten to cover over with clothing or rag in the night, had a slightly silty texture to it now as it went down, but given the same stuff was coating his mouth already, Berani didn't chide himself too much for the lapse. It would only have been mildly better had it been free of dust and smoke. Then a figure emerged from the dark between struggling lanterns down the hall. Samudra, walking back down the corridor connecting the bunkhouses through the shadows, was holding 2 bowls of rice he'd volunteered to fetch over in Fort Limu. They were the only 2 of their platoon awake after the end of watch at midnight, so far as Berani knew. It would be many hours until their group had a late rise and marched off to an equally late breakfast. With little to do bottled up underground until watch, the best Berani could think to do that morning, as on so many other painfully slow mornings in the bowels of the wall, was to pester the nearest kitchen into surrendering some food. Nothing in it but onion, Samudra told him as the pair sat down and took up the bowls in a crouch on the eaves of the tunnel. But it's warm at least. They shoveled the sticky grain into their mouths with their fingers greedily, as if it were a home-fried meal prepared by their mothers, and not a lifeless morass steamed in a great vat for thousands. It was an excuse to feel something pleasant, even if that something was as subtle as warm food on an empty stomach. The corridors about them were quiet, and beyond the muffled sounds of their claws on the dented old metal of their bowls, there was nothing to compete with the constant thrum of shells west of them. "You think we'll get any more letters?" Samudra asked, almost certainly trying to break the monotonous rumble, if only for a moment. "Now the Navy's pulled out and the river's dried up?" "Maybe," Berani said. "Someone in the chow line in Limu yesterday morning said they were planning to ship mail out by plane now. But they're also not taking new letters from us this week, which doesn't look promising. So it's anyone's guess when that'd start, if ever." Berani almost asked Samudra if he was waiting on something, but he refrained. They were all waiting on something, he figured. It was almost insulting to ask under these conditions. So he kept his eyes in his mush and kept eating. But Samudra didn't need to be asked. He spoke anyway. "They said grandfather was sick," Samudra told him. "That would have been 2 weeks ago now, when they took him off to the healers. He might be dead now, and I wouldn't know." "Well," Berani said, trying to sound as comforting as his youth and lack of experience allowed, and knowing as he did so he would not achieve his goal. "If he's in with the healers, that's as good as you could ask. Worry about you till the mail comes back in. Then if you're still around to know, you will." "Suppose so," Samudra agreed. The quiet fell again. and it was nearly half a minute before the quiet really struck Berani, for he realized in that moment that it actually was quiet. Empty bowl wobbling on the ground between his feet where he'd plopped it down on the concrete, he felt the hush impact Samudra beside him, though, like Berani, Samudra did not vocalize his realization. Their minds were so inured to the awful white noise of artillery that now, in its absence, they were petrified. It was almost 2 minutes before the sirens started, echoing out from Fort Limu into the wider halls. The hand-cranked machines were manned by the watch on the fort towers, and though Berani had never heard them before, he knew in his bones what they meant. The sound was odd, the agitated bray of a bull, Berani thought, breathless and droning on and on without end. And though the pair of them only stood for perhaps a third minute before their frozen stiffness waned with the shouts of men waking and the thud of booted feet running down halls, that moment felt an eternity to them. Then they were in the bustling bunkhouse, shouldering their way to their beds. The men slept and ate in uniform, and Samudra and Berani had the benefit of having already had their boots on, but they needed to grab their rifles and combat loads from beneath their beds. Berani flung on his pouches, shouldered his weapon, hung the UG-issued gas mask about his neck, and finally, with a care for the fabric which ran counter to the frantic rush of the moment, veiled his face beneath the eyes with the light wrap of his home-woven ribukedok. Across the bunkhouse, the faces of all of them were disappearing behind subtly differing veils of blue, made panoply by dyes from this or that maker, or this or that mother. But long drill meant even this hectic scramble was ordered by the standards of such things, and within 60 seconds, the platoon was stood up in its 5 sections with Lieutenant Satria at the door to lead them up. Marak held up the heavy load of both his machine gun and 2 rifles, and Dimas sagged under a pack and 2 tins filled with chained bullets for them at his side. Jorok and Gadin wheezed and grinned at some joke which had passed between them, only cowed when silence fell and Satria's glare lingered on them. Darmang and Jabat checked one another's veils and turbans, and Samudra rifled through a bag of tourniquets and alcohol and clamps and belts to ensure all was in order with his kit. Grenades were silently counted, 2 for each of the riflemen, and Agama drained a canteen of something Berani didn't doubt was liquor, no doubt saved for the moment. Pahala was uncharacteristically quiet and still, his eyes skyward, as if he could gaze through the ceiling. All around them, the other 4 sections were doing much the same, eyes either wide and honed or bright but distant above their veils. "It's time," Satria told them simply. His voice was firm, but Berani could tell even through the veil that he was as shaken as any of them. The lieutenant turned and exited, and they tumbled after him in order, trotting at speed up the corridor for the wall, led and followed by other platoons of Marines doing the same. Berani had expected some brief, rousing speech, but now he found he pitied Satria as much as the rest of them. If his not-so-beloved sister's husband had prepared words for the occasion had stolen them from the officer, and Berani could not blame him. Had any of them been called to stand before the others in that moment, all would have been next to mute. Berani's eyes lingered coolly on the dropped bowls by the doorway as they passed out into the halls, and amidst his terror and excitement and breathless twitchiness, he had a moment's insane, mundane clarity in which he realized he had not cleansed his hands after the meal, that his fingers were still sticky, and his prayers and washings were undone. And then the bowls were gone, and so were his everyday thoughts of routine and order. The third and highest firing line was their destination. The land out before them was still and dark, midnight not far behind them. Though the northern dredge and flanking rivers had been dry for days, Their bottoms were still silty, muddy morasses of pooled, stagnant water and dead fish beneath the constant rain. These pools caught muted lights and flashes as signals were sent from fort to fort along the wall, up out of view of Berani and the others. And above it all, that mewling, low siren was still rolling, a replacement to artillery's call which was less than welcome. Berani took up his place with rifle shouldered at the firing window. He was at one end of his 10-man section, and Agama the other, with the riflemen spread between, and Marok in the middle with his Topon light machine gun. 50 men in 5 such lines comprised a platoon's place on the firing line, and every 50 or so men, a heavy weapons nest was placed. There, teams of 2 or 3 UG with the garrison manned blocky, UG-built heavy machine guns. Up on Berani's topmost line, these teams manned hefty mortars bolted on hand-cranked, rotating platforms, and the lion folk at the stations were busily double-checking the angles and munitions. Satria and other lieutenants walked the backs of the men. They stood there some minutes, breaths held, looking out into the dark, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Pahala grunted just to Berani's right, mumbling, "They expect us to shoot in the dark?" Then rumbling came as redirected enemy guns picked up once more, this time striking forts east and west of the breach, looking to maim Lautani and UG gun barrels or firing ports. Still, forts like Limu or Min were far too distant for these impacts to be a direct threat to Berani or most others on that section of the wall, but they felt the tremors they made in their bones and knew that soon their guns would fall silent, whatever the fate of the wall. There was a shrill of whistles along the bastion, and the mortars among them cracked with blinding light and deafening life. Artillery too thundered in the forts, letting loose their payloads before the bombarding Sholoshaitians could silence them. But this first volley was a flare wave, and rather than blast afar off in the dark, the rounds blazed into life almost the moment they'd left their barrels, and streaked sluggish out into the night like fireworks back home in the Isles. They soared slow, flickering, painting the muddy landscape below in pale light. And in the gleam given off by them, shapes could be seen far out, a mile or more distant, but clear despite the cloudy night. Landships, hundreds upon hundreds of them, rumbling towards the wall at a marcher's measured pace. They were yet so distant no one could hear them, and between and before these crawling metal behemoths, trenches or saps mired the plain up to within a few hundred yards of the wall. Knowing Sholoshaiti, they had been dug in the weeks before, with thin roofs shielding detection from above, only to be collapsed now as avenues through which legions of men could get close without charging forth in the open. Massed men could be glimpsed from this or that angle within them, even if only faintly. They were more hint of motion at this distance and hour than true shapes, like columned ants or termites glimpsed massing for a surge from above. And strange blots of dark contrast loomed in the clouds as the flares passed under them. Sky fortresses, Berani figured. It was his first glimpse of them, for they had not yet strayed north of the outer wall into the potentially risky line of exchanged artillery fire from below. They flashed now and then with subtle, colored lights, and Berani guessed they must be signaling guns away in the distance, somehow coordinating strikes. Hold fire until their infantry come up to advance. Satria and the other officers were calling out in scattered, competing flow as they passed back and forth. The mortars will hit the landships, but if any get close, machine gun the tracks. Try and break them. If the tracks break, they're stuck. Focus your rifle fire on the men. But this was a difficult thing to do, because all the week prior had been alive with talk of the growing breaches in the east and west and south, on all portions of the wall Berani and the other men of Lautani could not see. And it was easy to imagine there, with seemingly all the land between the rivers alive with the carpeting advance of the enemy, that every other flank of the city looked the same, that the noose was tightening about them, and that every second wasted in waiting was vain. Yet logic-dictated ammunition would, in time, become precious, and Berani and the others held admirably in the face of quaking grip and twitching eye. Every second was agony, and yet still they held. And as flare waves went up between proper artillery or mortar fusillades to light the night, the tanks drew nearer, as did the massed men in their trenches. A few of the land ships were crippled from above as heavy mortar shells split them open, sending maimed dogmen tumbling from the twisted metal wreckage to lie broken in the mud. But such direct hits were difficult to score, and most fell alongside the vehicles, doing little as they peppered the sides with shrapnel and concussive force eaten up by the steel. The hits in Sholoshaishan saps were more heartening to the defenders, and far more deadly. For while it was just as difficult to land a shell in the middle of a trench as it was to hit a slow-moving armored crawler, the mortar bursts there were contained in the walled avenues. Even with the zigzag construction of the saps to limit such damage, it was clear to Berani that any mortar strike in the saps meant dozens of Imperial soldiers left dead or crippled in the muck. But the enemy did not quaver or falter beneath the rain and the shells, and though many thousands were killed out in all that dancing light and wavering shadow beneath the flares, it did not stop their advance. For painfully slow as time might crawl in that heart-pounding stretch of minutes, it, like the engines of Sholoshaidi, was still inching ever onward. And before Berani knew it, the tanks were past the saps in their hundreds, slowly and methodically converging off to his left, where the breach must lurk unseen in the west due to the arc of the wall, where once Fort Esh had stood. And the swarms of Sholoshaishan infantry, excited for the blood to come and pressed thick in the saps furthest forward, and stretching away into the dark distance unseen, rolling out their shrapnel-strewn dead to make space for yet more of their fellows to creep forth into the cover, gave the landships several long moments to gain a lead on them. There was a swelling chant rising among the Sholoshaishans, in that halting and harsh language of the desert highlands, and though the black-garbed Ektal, an ebon shadow on the field, led the cries, the regular army in their stark gold had soon picked it up, and it seemed to fill them with a wrath that bordered on mania, for they shrieked and jolted and stomped with the words of it, growing more animated in the gloom as the chant stretched on. Tlatoani and Harakwe were some of the only words Berani recognized. These, and the words Tepeklan and Teoatlan, the names of two of their cities. Though he could not know it, the refrain Mahuitzli ka Teoatlan, Tepeklan kemikayot, repeated so often in the clamor, meant glory to Teoatlan, Tepeklan eternal. These were men of Teoatlan. They were slamming rifle butt into soil, and clapping thigh or chest with open hand or closed fist, and the noise of them competed even with the roar of artillery or mortar as it rolled out and echoed off the slope of the last wall. And their keen eyes burned red and gold and orange in the glow of the flares overhead, as if the molten blood of their creator was in them. And their scalps, the soul-haired part of them, shaven ritually clean before battle and death, glistened with the rainfall, the glitter of 1,000,000 skulls arrayed before the intrepid defenders who looked on with triggers eager. There had been 3 legions of noble Ektal soldiery local to the great Sholoshaishan port of Teoatlan at the war's beginning, answerable to the king of the city. 2 legions of the regular army, bound to garrison duties in Teoatlan province as Coatzacoalcos commoners did their 2 years' mandatory service, had been standing and ready to deploy alongside them. But now, months into the conflict, with the commoners in a furor back home, Many older men out of the service had passed through grueling reassessment training and joined them. The wartime draft in Sholo-Shahidi at that time was at its least harsh, for in times of open war, as a matter of law both religious and temporal, all able common men between the age of majority and 30 are demanded to re-enlist. It was not forbidden for men beyond that count capable of passing reassessment to re-enter and commit, even if the draft did not call for it. It had been guessed, based on the observations of planes, that there were 20 regular army legions north of the city. But Teotihuacan had mustered 49 for the northern campaign, over 930,000 men, one of the most respectable portions judged against provincial population in all the empire. And so Teotihuacan, ruled from what had once been a seaside city of the Ug in years long gone, before even half a year embroiled in this greatest of wars had passed, had offered up over 900,000 of its sons, not even counting those 3 legions of Ektal career men. And there they stood, praising their god and roaring for death to take them to the fields which awaited the sons of the warhound in passing. Berani, shivers running up his spine, wondered a moment where the catfolk of Hurabaya, of Eztlan, were. A terrible thought, which would come back to him only later. Had not his father been petrified at the thought of the continental catfolk being sent against them? But in that second of hesitant uncertainty, the shrieking death whistles went up among the enemy, and a baying roar from a million mouths rose out on the plain, and across the miles-wide northern span, between the once lively banks of the dead Igtuku and Usal, the men of Sholo-Shahidi went over the top and out into the open in pursuit of their tanks, all crowding towards that center point of the breach, or else making for prearranged craters or dips in the land to lay down covering fire. While at first they poured out of the sloped mouths of their prepared saps, soon the sheer ecstatic press of them was too much, and they poured over the sides and ran up top in the open. And they screamed as they ran, wordless, formless, and bestial, the sound of mortal fear escaping the body as the sweep of the scale of what they were doing took hold of them, and they were borne forward as men upon a mythic tide, a hammer which was to crush and remake history, starting with the eldest city on the face of Haraklan. "Fire!" Satria cried somewhere behind. "Fire!" But Berani was already firing. They all were. The bolts and triggers on their Badai rifles were so familiar to their hands after the thousands of firings, both dry and live, the men had had with the reliable old weapons that the motion was second nature to them. But to shoot into the swarm of black and gold bees surging like a tidal swell towards the wall was nothing like shooting targets on a range. The hundreds of yards of distance might have made the task difficult if there were less enemy troops to shoot, but frankly, it was difficult to miss them, as thick as they were upon the field. Thousands and thousands of rifles lined the 3 firing floors of Berani's portion of the wall alone. Mortar shells threw up earth and smoke as they impacted the ground among the enemy, scything legs or limbs or innards with their steel spray. Marok's machine gun hummed, as did all those of the garrison, and amidst the slaughter it was near impossible to tell if one's shot, aimed or not, had hit home. The barrels smoked with heat, and the mud of the land about the northern dredge grew black with the blood of the wounded and the dead. Gas was billowing up off west towards the breach, and the first and fastest ranks on foot among the enemy were already gaining the mass of torn stone and concrete, which had once been Fort Esh, where they passed out of Berani's sight. Perhaps half the land ships, Berani realized, were not pushing on up over the rubble of the ruined fort for which the Shaishan assault was bound. These were not carriers fitted with side guns, but rather heavily armed firing platforms for serious cannon. Some sank and were mired in mud, and a handful were made still by broken tread, but even these, close as they now were to the wall, were dangerous. They began to fire back on the emplacements most damaging to the foe on the wall. First the mortar platforms, and then the heavy machine gun nests. The first hit on their position of wall struck a glancing hit just beneath the firing window one platoon over, but threw such a shroud of stone and steel shrapnel that the targeted UG mortarmen and a half-dozen Lautani riflemen to either side were chopped up by a cloud of lightning-fast fragments spat out by the blast, funneled up by the angle of the window into necks and faces and eyes. Undaunted by small arms fire from the wall, the land ships continued their barrage, and dozens of such strikes sounded, followed by the screams and writhings and groans of the dying. The riflemen of Sholoshahidi, along with their light machine gun teams, had by now gained a low ridge out in the field beyond the dredge, a shallow mud bank of torn grime and little more. But from the peak of it, they were firing bullets back towards the firing windows, and though their position from below was desperate, it was impossible that so great a volume of fire would not now and then strike home. And so it did, for Lautani throats were torn open and skulls were split wide by the rounds of the foe. A thundering blast sounded as a tank shell struck the inner roof of the upper firing corridor off to Berani's right, near where Dimas and Marak were running their machine gun. Though Berani was too concussed and absorbed with the mass of moving men out before them to know in detail what was happening off to his side, he glimpsed peripherally Marak slumped at an unnatural angle over the mouth of the firing window, where his body was chewed by enemy rifle shot. And still he fired, emptying each clip of its rounds before bending low out of the firing window and reloading, then popping up to empty once more. Again and again, dozen after ringing dozen, his head thumping and his ears long having given way to the constant whine of long-term damage from the firing, even beneath the mild shielding of the turbine's press. And then Satria was beside him, yelling into those battered ears as he leaned in, saying, "They're inside, Fort Limu. They're inside. Follow me." Berani began to ask how, but as he turned to look after Lieutenant Satria's back as the officer moved off into the dust and smoke, the rear of his uniform clouded red with 3 exit wounds from shots down the corridor, and he fell limp and dead all at once to the concrete as if strings about his shoulders had been severed. Berani, immediately understanding, grabbed Pahala by the shoulder, who still fired on doggedly from the window, and they began running in the direction Satria had started to lead them, straight into the vague haze which had filled the riddled innards of the wall. Berani firing blindly down the center of the corridor as he went, and praying he was not shooting his own men. "Enemies in the fort," he was shouting, hoping those of his section, or broader platoon, who could hear him would understand. "Back to Limu. They're inside." They passed Dimas, ripped in two by the tank shell which had killed Marak. Jabat's head, wedged up against the back wall along the ground shorn of turban or veil, had been thrown from his body, which was nowhere to be seen in the haze. Jorok's throat had been ripped open, leaving the Lake Kuning man to tumble down and bleed out against the base of the firing wall. Godin, shot himself through the chest, lay atop Jorok at the head of a trail of his own lifeblood, marking the spot from which he had dragged himself to die there. All this Berani barely had time to glimpse, stepping over and beyond at a run as he sprinted down the corridor. Then Samudra, checking a bad graze of the skull Darmang had taken from a close-call rifle round, came into view, and Berani shouted them along after him, never breaking his stride as he passed. He nearly tripped over Agama, who was hurrying in a crouch against the firing wall in the same direction Berani was headed, rifle working. Shot was whirring past them in the vague smog about their heads, and every second they spent in the miasma stealing their vision was another chance they'd be stricken. "Hurry!" Berani cried. "We have to get free of this." Agama sprang up and guided Berani and Pahala over to the inner wall as they went by him, and Darmang and Samudra followed close behind. Hugging the concrete, they moved as quickly as they could. And ahead of them through the haze, he could hear strangely accented orders in their own tongue. And he knew at once who it was that had come for them. They stumbled into others in the chaos, and did their best to sort those who weren't shot into the line behind to follow them. Berani would be grazed by a bullet north of his hip during this charge, but didn't realize this until long after. In the moment, all he knew was forward, and his only thoughts were of murder. He fixed his bayonet and ensured he had one of his few remaining clips loaded as he ran, and heard Pahala and the others following suit in the swirling gloom at his back. The Ektol of Eztlan province had blasted up through the floor of Fort Limu just after the charge had been sounded out beyond the wall, as had other legions under the other forts along the outer wall. And occupied as the staff and artillerists inside had been in those deafening confines returning fire and coordinating their response to the assault on the breach, it had taken far too long for the command of the Lautani expeditionary force in Limu to realize what was happening as floor after floor was captured by the enemy pouring into the building from below. It was a group of these, firing blindly down the hostile firing corridor before them, which Berani tumbled into when the hundreds of yards of hall were eaten away beneath his pumping legs, and he burst through the open doorway into the fortress. The black-uniformed Imperial Lautani were low to the ground, the better to avoid the shrapnel being tossed about by the tank bombardment along the wall. But this meant when Berani came out of the smoke into their midst, he stumbled over the 4 enemy riflemen in the doorway, and into a group of their kneeling fellows behind. Whatever grace saw him tumble unshot out of the murk also allowed him to catch his weight on a forward lunge of his leg, and he stabilized himself by punching into the ribs of one of the kneeling Ektol with his bayonet. It happened too quick to think about. Before he or the enemy could register what was happening, Agama and Pahala were sticking the ones laying prone from above behind him, and Berani had ripped free his rifle, shot one of the kneeling foes, and then fallen onto a third who had reflexively grabbed his weapon to turn it aside, both of them tumbling into a wild and uncoordinated grapple. But Berani, as many boyhood foes on the lakes had learned, was frightfully strong. Rowing and climbing had made this son of Tujuhdanau bulky beyond his height, and as the riflemen he tangled with attempted to roll him using their shared grip on the barrel of Berani's weapon, he did not budge. Now on top, Berani slammed the barrel of the weapon down again and again into the snout of the man beneath him, knocking loose teeth and powdering bone as the strength of the weaker's arms gave way, and he was allowed to really go to work. The head of the Eztlan man beneath him, once a face silken-furred and colored not unlike his own, became a mass of fragments held together by the sack of flesh about them, wholly unrecognizable. It was only when Agama struck him on the shoulder and shouted for Berani to stop that he did so. The remaining Imperial Lautani were dead about him. The others had finished them. He stood, shaking, catching his breath. To his right, Darmong, quick on his feet, shot another of the Eztlan Ektol as they rounded the corner on the stairs down to the level below, snapping Berani wholly out of his stupor. Shouts followed from beneath, yet again in the strange accent of the peninsula. Berani plucked out the pin on a grenade from his belt and waited several seconds before flinging it down the flight at an angle. The many practice tosses in Bessi Palabuhan paid off, and the explosive ricocheted off the side wall and down the next sweep of stairs, where it detonated amidst shrieks and groans of the enemy. Agama, focused and keen, was right behind the blast, waving Darmong down with him, rifles raised as they swept the corner and fired into the landing below, exposing as little of themselves as possible in tight quarters. "Come down," Samadra was screaming along the upward stairway to the rear, hoping that uppermost floor, where the biggest guns were platformed, was still not captured. "The fort is taken. We have to fight our way down." Berani pulled him along as he and Pahala pushed down the stairs in the wake of the others, a scattering of a dozen stray members of remaining sections behind them, telling Samudra, "They either know or they're dead. We have to focus if we want to get out. The only exits are on the ground. Our orders are to fight, then withdraw to the north wall when the enemy breaches the outer wall. It's breached." And then they were shifting down through the building, tossing grenades around corners, and wheeling about dips in the stairway at breakneck pace with fingers heavy on their triggers. They were on a tight timetable, and they knew it. Somewhere below their feet, hundreds of hostile Eztlan Lautani were pouring in a stream into the bowels of Fort Limu. The longer it took to descend, the more there would be down in the dark. More ocean-garbed men of the Duumvirate joined them now and then, but for the most part, it was only foes they met in the fort. The men of the islands were dead, and the mixed Lautani combatants, both in black and in blue, formed a horrid landscape which had to be picked over amidst torn concrete and scattered rubble to move through the fort. Agama was shot in the shoulder, and Darmang took a bad bullet to the thigh from behind as they crossed to the last descent from a room they'd trusted was clear after a grenade toss. He had to hop the rest of the way down on Samudra's shoulder, bleeding all the way. And then they were below ground level, facing the corridor back towards the bunkhouses in which they'd spent the past weeks. And in the central hub room of the lower fort, Raja Bayani and 100 other higher officers with rifles in hand nearly shot them dead as they exited the stairway down. Apparently, they had been pushed back into the bunk corridor, and had only fought their way back in just as Berani and the others had come to the bottom. "Berani," his father gasped under his breath, so low Berani might well have been the only one to hear it across the intervening space in all that distant clamor. His bright eyes were wide. He waved them over. The lord of the expeditionary force was dead, and more due to his calm than any seniority of rank among the other older high officers, Bayani was giving orders until proper custom could be observed. "Out into the fields," he ordered them. "Go, all of you. Into the pre-dug saps and on until you reach the forts on the north wall. Stop for nothing." Berani obeyed, as did the others. His eyes met with his father's a moment as he passed, and then the Raja was behind him. Even before Berani was halfway down the darkened tunnel towards the stark light of flares in the sky outside, gunfire echoed up the way towards him from behind. More Ektal were coming into the fort from the depths, and Raja Bayani was back at the exit holding them off with his men. Berani hesitated in the packed corridor, and Pahala dragged him along by the arm to get him free as men began to push and shout. "The Raja told us to go," he was saying. And then they were out in the cool air of pre-dawn, the sky still radiant with high-flung flares, looking out over the outer fields to a city's darkened skyline made unrecognizable by weeks of bombardment. The glum silhouette of the ziggurat of the sun in the distance was lopsided, as if great bites had been taken from the brick by some unspeakable titan, and the pillar of dawn spilling from its heart was faint and guttering. "Run!" The voice of some unknown officer rang out amongst them, and Berani, though his instinct was again to linger and watch for the emergence of his father, was swept along in the mishmash tide of Marines as the Lautani fell back to the inner walls. Off west to Berani's right as the Marines pushed south into the waist-deep saps sided each way by shoulder-high mounds of the loose-dug earth, he glimpsed Ugg in their garb of blue and gold doing the same. As they gained real distance, he saw that a 1,000-strong contingent of large Shaishans in heavy armor was pouring out from the breach at Esh to give chase, tanks at the crest of the rubble pass at their backs, firing out over the Ektal into the fields at the fleeing defenders. Artillery landed among them, and bullets fired from hundreds of yards off by conquering Shaishans occasionally struck true. Now and then, scalps were torn open or throats caught stray round or fragment above the banks of the saps. The ranks of their fleeing columns from trench to trench grew less and less bunched. Samudra stopped with Darmong somewhere at a divot or cubby in the saps to finally tend the man's shot thigh as he grew sluggish and unresponsive, and Berani lost sight of them. He only realized long after it happened that he had lost them, and, climbing the muddy dirt mound alongside the sap for a better view of the line behind, he could not see his lost men. But he did see something else. The tail end of the duumvirate marines flowing from the outer wall was tangled up with a mass of the Ektal in plate from the breach, and black-uniformed catfolk of the southern peninsula were streaming out to add to the imbalance. On a slight rise in the low, rolling and artillery-churned hills of the outer fields afar off, surrounded by enemy soldiers in their dour armor, Berani saw the glint of sharpened metal and heard the crack of a familiar pistol. He saw the uniform of a marine officer, the shine of metals and the hulking, feather-crested outline of some towering Shaishan lord which opposed him. They fought blade to blade on the rise as others watched on, as if it were a knightly contest of old. The thick machete balato against the toothy sheen of the jagged makwahwit. But that lean marine officer buckled beneath the strength of the blows of his opponent, and with the magazine of his pistol spent fruitless in the chest plate of his foe, and his sword arm swept wide by his enemy, Berani watched the blue-clad hero's turbaned head swept from his shoulders, and knew in his heart, regardless of distance or obscurity as he watched, that he had just witnessed the death of his father. Pahala, who had come up beside him in silence despite the storm of steel still whirling about them, gently guided him wordless back down into the sap, where Berani faded alongside him into the jostled stream of other muddy, bloody, and broken men.